You should know what happened to our past throughout history's long years and why it is the most important event in history. How many civilizations have we had in the past, and how did they vanish or perish or fall? Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it. And be sure to subscribe to our channel for more history videos in the future. As you settle in and let the weight of the day gently slip away, allow your thoughts to drift back across the quiet expanse of time. Over the long arc of human existence, societies have risen in many places, each one building its own intricate patterns of life, only to see those patterns slowly unravel and fade. Scholars who have studied the remains and records left behind tell us there is no single, precise count of how many civilizations have existed. Some speak of at least 6 great cradles where complex ways of living first appeared independently, scattered across distant lands. Yet when we look more carefully, considering every society that formed cities, developed systems of rule, and created lasting traditions, the number grows far larger, reaching into the dozens and even beyond 100, depending on the measure we use. What remains constant, like a soft and unchanging truth, is that nearly every one of them eventually vanished or perished or fell. Sometimes the ending came gradually, like a river quietly changing its course over many lifetimes. Sometimes it arrived more swiftly amid shifting conditions. In the gentle hours ahead, we will walk through these endings one by one, not with haste or alarm, but with the calm understanding that each fall holds its own quiet lesson in the long story of our past. Let us begin where many records first become clear, in the ancient lands between 2 great rivers, the place known as Mesopotamia. Here, more than 5,000 years ago, the Sumerian civilization took shape. Cities such as Uruk, and Lagash grew with temples reaching toward the sky and networks of canals that brought water to fields of barley and wheat. For centuries, these places flourished. Yet over time, the very success of their farming began to alter the earth beneath them. The waters drawn from the rivers carried dissolved salts from deep in the soil. When the sun evaporated the moisture in the fields, those salts remained behind, slowly accumulating year after year until the ground grew white and bitter. Crops that once grew tall and plentiful began to wither. Yields fell steadily. What had fed thriving populations could no longer sustain them in the same way. At the same time, the rivers themselves, the Tigris and the Euphrates, shifted their courses in ways no one could fully control. Channels that had watered entire regions ran dry or moved far from the cities they once served. Periods of reduced rainfall added their weight, turning fertile plains drier and less forgiving. As resources grew scarce, the strength of the city-states weakened. Invasions from neighboring peoples became more frequent, pressing against borders that were already strained. By around 1700 years before our Common Era, many of the southern Sumerian cities stood empty or nearly so. The great temples fell silent. The population drifted northward toward newer centers of power. The distinct Sumerian language and the unique ways of life it carried gradually slipped away, absorbed or replaced by the cultures that followed. It was not one sudden blow that ended Sumer, but a long, steady fading, where each small change in the land and the waters and the balance of power eroded the foundations until the civilization as it had been known was no more. Even earlier within the same broad region, the Akkadian Empire had risen and then vanished in its own manner. Building upon Sumerian roots, it created one of the first large-scale empires around 2,300 years before our Common Era. For a time, its reach extended across many lands, yet within roughly 2 centuries it too unraveled. Geological traces speak of a prolonged dry period that settled over the region, a drought lasting perhaps 200 years or more. Rivers ran lower, fields produced less, famine spread through the countryside. With food scarce and order harder to maintain, the empire fractured. Cities were abandoned or reduced. The central authority dissolved and the lands fragmented into smaller, more local powers. Once again, the combination of changing climate, strained resources, and the pressures that followed brought a once mighty structure to an end, leaving only ruins and echoes for later generations to find. Drifting now eastward in our thoughts, we come to another early and remarkable society, the civilization of the Indus Valley, sometimes called Harappan. It emerged around the same distant era, thriving along the broad plains of what are now parts of Pakistan and northwest India. Cities such as Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa stood with carefully planned streets, advanced drainage systems, and large public buildings. Trade flowed along the rivers and beyond. For several centuries, this way of life endured with a quiet stability. Yet beginning around 2,500 years before our Common Era, subtle shifts in the climate began to appear. The heavy summer monsoons that had watered the region for so long started to weaken and change their pattern. Rainfall became less reliable. The great rivers, including one known in tradition as the Sarasvati, began to dry or alter their paths. Evidence from ancient lake beds and cave formations shows a long, gradual drying that stretched over many generations. Without the steady floods that had renewed the fields, agriculture grew more difficult. The large urban centers, so dependent on abundant water and fertile soil, could no longer support their populations in the same numbers. One by one, the grand cities were left behind. People moved eastward toward the foothills and new, smaller settlements where water could still be found in more manageable ways. There was little sign of widespread violence or sudden destruction. Instead, the change unfolded slowly across 2 or 3 centuries. By around 1900 to 1700 years before our Common Era, the great phase of urban life had ended. The once bustling streets grew quiet. The sophisticated drainage systems fell into disuse. The population dispersed into villages and rural life, carrying some traditions forward but leaving the grand scale of the earlier cities behind. The Indus civilization did not vanish in a single dramatic moment. It faded as the rains and rivers changed, until the urban heart of the society had gently dissolved into the landscape. In these earliest examples, we already see patterns that will echo through many later stories. The land itself could shift in ways that no amount of human effort could fully overcome. Rivers moved, rainfall patterns altered, soil that had once been generous grew tired or salty under constant use. When these changes combined with the pressures of growing populations and the needs of complex cities, the balance that had sustained a civilization often tipped. Trade routes faltered when resources grew scarce. Social structures strained under hunger or uncertainty. What had seemed permanent began to slip away, sometimes over decades, sometimes across centuries, until the society that had defined itself through its cities and systems was no longer recognizable in the same form. The people did not always disappear entirely. Many simply moved, adapted, or blended into what came next. Yet the particular civilization, with its unique scale and organization, had perished. As we pause here in our quiet reflection, the weight of these first endings rests softly around us. The Sumerian cities that once rang with life now lie beneath layers of earth, their temples and canals long silent. The Indus settlements stand as mounds in the plains, empty of the voices and footsteps that once filled them. Each fall reminds us how delicate the thread of continuity can be, even for societies that achieved great heights. In the parts of our journey still ahead, we will continue this gentle exploration, turning our attention to other lands and other times where civilizations rose and then, in their own ways, faded from view. For now, let these early stories settle within you like the slow turning of pages in an ancient book, inviting rest and quiet wonder as the hours drift onward. As the gentle rhythm of our thoughts continues to carry us forward through the quiet corridors of time, we find ourselves lingering for a moment longer on the fragile balance that once held these early societies together. The endings we have glimpsed so far remind us how interconnected everything could be. The health of the soil, the steadiness of the rains, the flow of rivers, the harmony among people and their leaders. When one thread loosened, others often followed until the whole fabric began to fray and separate. Yet these were only the beginnings of such stories. Many more civilizations would emerge in distant lands and later eras, each one building its own intricate world, only to face its own slow or sudden unraveling. Let us now turn our attention westward, toward the sun-drenched island of Crete, where the Minoan civilization flourished in the warm embrace of the Aegean Sea. Around 4,000 years ago, this society created palaces of remarkable beauty and complexity, Knossos, Phaistos, Malia, structures with grand courtyards, colorful frescoes depicting leaping bulls and graceful figures, intricate plumbing systems that brought water through clay pipes, and storerooms filled with olive oil and grain. The Minoans sailed far across the Mediterranean, trading pottery, metals, and ideas with distant shores. Their world seemed secure, wrapped in the protective blue of the sea. Yet around 3,500 years ago, profound changes began to settle over the island. A massive volcanic eruption on the nearby island of Thera sent ash clouds high into the sky, blanketing parts of Crete in layers of pumice and dust. Tsunamis rolled across the sea, crashing against coastal settlements and washing away harbors. The air carried poisonous fumes for days. While the palaces themselves may not have been completely destroyed in every case, the disruption was deep and lasting. Crops failed under the weight of ash and altered weather. Trade routes faltered as ships hesitated to sail through uncertain waters. The once vibrant economy slowed. In the decades that followed, signs of strain appeared: fewer grand buildings, simpler pottery styles, hints of unrest in the archaeological layers. Some scholars speak of invaders from the mainland Mycenaean peoples who gradually exerted influence, perhaps taking control of key sites. Others point to internal shifts where the old ways of centralized palace life no longer held. By around 1200 years before our Common Era, the distinctive Minoan culture had faded. The grand palaces stood empty or repurposed. The language written in linear fell silent, its script undeciphered to this day. What remained blended into new traditions carried by those who came after. The Minoan world did not vanish overnight in flames or flood alone. It diminished gradually as the land, the sea, and perhaps the people themselves adjusted to a changed reality, until the unique civilization that had once defined the island was no longer present in its original form. Further to the east, in the highlands of Anatolia, another powerful society had risen, the Hittite Empire. From their capital at Hattusa, the Hittites commanded a vast territory stretching across mountains and plains, forging alliances through marriage, diplomacy, and formidable chariots. Their archives of clay tablets reveal a sophisticated legal system, treaties with neighbors, and a pantheon of gods honored in grand temples. For centuries, this empire held sway as one of the great powers of the late Bronze Age. But around 1,200 years before our Common Era, the same turbulent period that touched so many lands reached the Hittites. Evidence from ruined city walls and burned layers suggests widespread destruction. Hattusa itself was abandoned, its massive gates left ajar, its libraries scattered. Theories abound as to why. Some speak of groups known as the Sea Peoples, mysterious migrants or raiders moving across the eastern Mediterranean, disrupting trade and pressing against borders already weakened. Others point to prolonged dry conditions that reduced harvests and strained the resources needed to maintain armies and cities. Earthquakes may have damaged key fortifications. Internal rivalries and succession disputes could have eroded central authority at a critical moment. Whatever the precise combination, the empire fragmented. Vassal states declared independence or fell to local powers. Populations dispersed into smaller communities in the countryside. The Hittite language and administrative traditions faded from daily use, surviving only in scattered remnants. By the early centuries of the Iron Age, the once mighty empire had dissolved into the landscape, its grand capital overtaken by weeds and time. These interconnected endings around the turn of the 12th century before our Common Era mark what scholars sometimes call a broader systems collapse across the eastern Mediterranean, a time when drought lingered for generations, trade networks unraveled, migrations increased, and the old palace economies could no longer sustain themselves. Cities that had relied on distant grain shipments or imported tin for bronze weapons found supplies interrupted. Famine followed scarcity. Social order strained under the weight of hunger and uncertainty. One kingdom's fall weakened its neighbors, creating a cascade that touched Egypt's new kingdom, Mycenaean Greece, and the cities of the Levant. Egypt endured longer than most, its pharaohs repelling some invaders and holding the Nile's lifeline, yet even there the old grandeur dimmed, with economic troubles and weakened authority in the centuries that followed. The Bronze Age world, so tightly woven together, unraveled thread by thread until a new, simpler era emerged from the quiet ruins. As these reflections settle softly around us, we sense how no civilization exists in true isolation. What happens in one land can ripple outward, touching others through trade, migration, or shared climate. The Hittite gate standing open, the Minoan palaces falling silent, the echoes of disrupted voyages across the sea, all speak to the same gentle truth, that even the most elaborate structures of stone and custom rest upon foundations that can shift with time. In the calm hours still before us, we will continue this unhurried journey, turning our gaze to other places and periods where societies rose with hope and promise, only to see their paths diverge toward endings of their own. For now, let these stories rest with you like the slow fading of twilight, inviting peace as the night deepens. As the quiet stories of those distant Mediterranean lands continue to settle within you like the soft settling of dust over long abandoned stones, we sense how the threads of connection among societies could both strengthen and endanger them. When one great center weakened, the ripples spread outward, touching allies and trade partners until the entire web trembled. Yet time moved onward, carrying new societies into being in far-flung places, each one weaving its own patterns of life, belief, and labor, only to encounter its own quiet unraveling in due course. Let us now drift across vast oceans in our thoughts to the dense green lowlands of Mesoamerica, where the Maya civilization once flourished in remarkable splendor. From around 2,000 years before our Common Era and reaching its fullest expression during what scholars call the Classic Period, roughly between 250 and 900 of our Common Era, the Maya built towering pyramid temples that pierced the canopy, observatories aligned with the movements of stars and planets, intricate systems of mathematics and writing carved into stone, and sprawling cities such as Tikal, Palenque, Capan, and Calakmul. These centers pulsed with life, markets filled with jade, feathers, cacao, and obsidian, rituals honoring cycles of time, rulers who traced their lineage to divine ancestors. The population in the southern lowlands may have reached several millions, sustained by intensive agriculture, raised fields, terraced hillsides, reservoirs, and careful management of seasonal rains. Yet beginning in the 8th and 9th centuries of our Common Era, a profound shift began to unfold across many of these southern regions. One by one, the great urban centers were gradually left behind. Temples that had once echoed with ceremonies stood silent. Elite residences fell into disrepair. Monumental inscriptions, which had recorded royal deeds and astronomical observations for centuries, ceased almost entirely. Populations dispersed into smaller, more scattered settlements, and the elaborate networks of alliance and exchange that had bound the lowlands together frayed and diminished. The changes did not arrive in a single cataclysmic moment. Evidence from lake sediments, stalagmites in caves, and pollen records preserved in the earth points to a series of prolonged dry periods, sometimes called megadroughts, that settled over the region with increasing severity. Rainfall, upon which maize agriculture so heavily depended, became unreliable and reduced for extended stretches, perhaps spanning decades at a time. Reservoirs that had buffered against lean years ran low or dried. Crops withered under relentless sun. With food supplies strained, the delicate balance that supported large populations and the demands of rulers, priests, and artisans grew fragile. At the same time, the very success of earlier centuries may have added pressure. Growing numbers of people had cleared ever more forest for fields and fuel, altering local environments in ways that made the land less resilient when rains faltered. Deforestation reduced the soil's ability to hold moisture and increased erosion. Overuse of resources in some areas led to declining yields even before the driest years arrived. Competition for remaining fertile land and water intensified among neighboring city-states, and evidence from skeletal remains and defensive walls suggests periods of heightened conflict, warfare that disrupted trade, displaced communities, and further strained food production. Social strains emerged as well. The elaborate hierarchy that had once seemed eternal, kings claiming divine right, nobles supported by tribute, commoners laboring in fields, began to show cracks under scarcity. When harvests failed repeatedly, the ability of rulers to provide for their people diminished. Rituals that promised cosmic order lost their persuasive power if the rains did not follow prayers. Some scholars see signs of unrest or rejection of the old order, abandoned monuments, defaced portraits of kings, shifts towards simpler forms of life away from the grand centers. Not every Maya community vanished. Northern regions like Chichen Itza later rose in prominence with different traditions, and Maya people continued and still continue across the region, carrying languages, knowledge, and ways of life forward in adapted forms. Yet the classic southern lowland world, with its dense urbanism and monumental focus, faded away over roughly 2 centuries, leaving pyramids to be reclaimed by jungle vines and silence to replace the once bustling plazas. This slow dissolution echoes patterns seen elsewhere, environmental shifts that tested the limits of human adaptation, compounded by the pressures of population, resource demands, and social organization. When the rains grew sparse and unpredictable, the intricate systems that had sustained greatness could no longer hold. Cities that had seemed eternal became quiet ruins, overtaken by forest, their stories preserved only in stone carvings half buried in earth and in the enduring memory of descendants. Turning our gentle gaze now southward along the Andean Cordillera, we find another remarkable society that rose amid high mountains and coastal deserts. The civilization centered at Tiwanaku, near the shores of Lake Titicaca in what is now Bolivia. From around 300 to 1000 of our Common Era, Tiwanaku grew into a major center of power and influence. Its people engineered raised fields to farm in the cold, high-altitude basin, built monumental stone gateways carved with intricate motifs, and developed extensive trade networks reaching to the Pacific coast and beyond. The city itself, with its sunken courtyards, massive gateways like the Gate of the Sun, and precisely cut andesite blocks fitted without mortar, reflected a sophisticated understanding of astronomy, agriculture, and ritual life. Tiwanaku's reach extended culturally and economically across a wide region, influencing distant communities through shared symbols, ceramics, and perhaps pilgrimages. Yet by around 1000 of our Common Era, the great center entered a period of decline. The monumental construction slowed and then ceased. Populations dispersed from the core area. The raised field systems, which had allowed intensive farming in a challenging environment, fell into disuse in many places. Evidence from ice cores drilled high in distant glaciers and from lake sediments reveals that a prolonged dry period settled over the Altiplano during these centuries, a time when precipitation decreased significantly, lake levels dropped, and the delicate moisture balance needed for agriculture shifted unfavorably. With water scarcer, the productivity of the raised fields declined. Food surpluses that had once supported large gatherings, specialist artisans, and long-distance exchange grew harder to maintain. Social cohesion, built around shared rituals and the authority of leaders tied to cosmic order, may have weakened as promises of abundance went unfulfilled. Some communities turned inward, focusing on more localized survival strategies rather than the grand interconnected system that had defined Tiwanaku at its height. The city itself was not violently destroyed. Instead, it was gradually abandoned, its stones left standing amid encroaching grasses, its influence fading as new patterns of life emerged in the region. Further north along the same mountainous spine, the Wari civilization, with its capital near modern Ayacucho in Peru, followed a parallel path. Flourishing roughly between 600 and 1000 of our Common Era, Wari built administrative centers, road networks, and terraced fields across a broad territory. Its expansion brought standardization in ceramics, architecture, and perhaps governance to distant valleys. Yet around the same time as Tiwanaku's waning, Wari too began to contract. Dry conditions strained agriculture in the highlands. Overextended administrative systems may have become difficult to sustain when resources tightened. Centers were abandoned or reduced in scale, and the integrated regional system fragmented into more localized polities. In both cases, the highland Andean societies had engineered remarkable solutions to harsh environments: raised fields, terraces, camelit herding, long-distance exchange. Yet when climate patterns shifted toward sustained aridity, those adaptations reached their limits. Populations adjusted by dispersing, simplifying, or relocating to moister zones, leaving behind the monumental cores that had once symbolized unity and power. As these reflections drift onward like mist rising from highland lakes at dawn, we notice again how the land's quiet changes, subtle year by year, yet profound over generations, could reshape entire ways of life. Societies that mastered mountains and coasts still rested upon the mercy of rain and temperature patterns beyond direct control. When those patterns turned less generous, the elaborate structures of stone, field, and custom could not always endure unchanged. In the calm expanse still ahead, we will continue this unhurried tracing of endings, moving toward other times and places where civilizations met their own gentle or abrupt conclusions. For now, let the images of silent pyramids entwined with vines and wind-swept stone gateways rest softly with you, inviting the mind to ease deeper into stillness as the night carries on. As the soft echoes of abandoned pyramids and highland gateways fade into the deepening calm of your thoughts, we allow the mind to drift further along the winding river of time. The patterns we have glimpsed so far, the slow drying of lands once fertile, the straining of systems built upon fragile balances, the quiet dispersal of people when the old centers could no longer hold, continue to appear in new places under different skies, yet carrying the same gentle undertone of impermanence. No society, however ingeniously constructed, has proven entirely immune to the long, patient shifts of climate, resource limits, internal tensions, or the arrival of unforeseen pressures from without. Let us now turn our attention northward, to the broad river valleys and fertile plains where the ancient Egyptian civilization took root and endured for an extraordinary span. Along the life-giving Nile, from roughly 3,100 years before our common era through the Ptolemaic era and into Roman times, Egypt developed one of the longest-lasting complex societies in recorded history. The Nile's annual inundation deposited rich black silt, renewing fields year after year. Pharaohs ruled as living gods, overseeing vast temple complexes at Karnak and Luxor, monumental pyramids and sphinxes at Giza, elaborate tombs carved deep into desert cliffs, and a bureaucracy that managed grain storage, taxation, and monumental building projects. For most of its 3,000-year arc, this civilization appeared remarkably resilient, able to weather invasions, restore order after periods of fragmentation, and adapt its institutions across changing dynasties. Yet even Egypt, with its seemingly eternal river, eventually entered phases of profound decline. The Old Kingdom, which built the Great Pyramids, weakened around 2,100 years before our common era after a series of low Nile floods. Reduced inundations meant less silt and poorer harvests. Centralized authority fractured into regional powers during the First Intermediate Period. While the Middle Kingdom later reunited the land and brought renewed prosperity, similar stresses recurred. The most decisive unraveling, however, arrived during the Late Bronze Age and afterward, overlapping with the wider disruptions we touched upon earlier. Around 1,200 years before our common era, Egypt faced the so-called Sea Peoples, groups of migrants and raiders moving across the eastern Mediterranean. Ramesses III repelled major incursions in dramatic campaigns recorded on temple walls at Medinet Habu, yet the effort drained resources. Trade routes that once brought timber from Lebanon, copper from Cyprus, and tin for bronze grew disrupted. At roughly the same time, paleoclimatic records from the Nile Delta, tree rings in distant regions, and sediment cores indicate a period of reduced rainfall across North Africa and the eastern Mediterranean, a dry event lasting generations. The Nile's flow, while never failing completely, became less abundant and less predictable in some decades. Grain surpluses shrank. The cost of maintaining large armies, temples, and a sprawling administration grew harder to bear. Internal strains compounded these challenges. Corruption in the bureaucracy increased during the new kingdom's later years. Tomb robberies became widespread as economic hardship deepened. Workers at Deir al-Medina, who built royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, went on strike, the earliest recorded labor action in history, because rations were not delivered. By the Third Intermediate Period, beginning around 1100 years before our Common Era, pharaonic power fragmented again. Libya, Nubia, and local Egyptian elites asserted independence or dominance. Foreign rulers, Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, Persians, took control of the throne in succession. Each occupation eroded the old sense of divine continuity. Temples lost land and wealth. The use of hieroglyphic writing for everyday purposes declined. When Alexander the Great arrived in 332 before our Common Era, he entered a land already transformed, still culturally rich, still revering its ancient gods, yet no longer an independent great power in the same unbroken line. The fall of ancient Egypt was therefore not abrupt annihilation, but a very long twilight. The Nile continued to flow, the language evolved into Coptic, many religious ideas persisted into Christianity, and the people remained. Yet the civilization as it had defined itself for millennia, with its pharaohs as gods incarnate, its monumental stone expressions of eternity, its tightly centralized theocratic state, slowly dissolved into new political realities, new faiths, and new ways of organizing life under successive foreign rulers. Continuing our unhurried journey, we now cross the Atlantic once more, this time to the high plateaus and coastal valleys of what is now Peru, where the Chimu civilization rose to prominence. Flourishing between approximately 900 and 1470 of our Common Era, the Chimu built Chan Chan, the largest adobe city ever constructed in the Americas. Sprawling over 20 square kilometers, Chan Chan contained 9 immense walled compounds, each a palace citadel belonging to a successive ruler. Intricate adobe friezes depicted fish, waves, seabirds, and geometric patterns. The Chimu engineered sophisticated irrigation canals stretching dozens of kilometers from Andean rivers, turning desert into fertile fields of cotton, maize, beans, and squash. They produced exquisite gold and silver work, textiles of extraordinary fineness, and maintained extensive maritime fishing using reed boats. Their empire expanded along the coast, absorbing smaller polities through conquest and alliance. Yet this impressive coastal society met its end in the 15th century. Around 1470, the expanding Inca Empire, based in the highlands, turned its attention westward. Inca armies, disciplined and supplied through their own remarkable road and storage systems, marched down from the mountains. After a series of battles and sieges, the Chimu capital fell. The last Chimu ruler, Minchinsaman, was taken to Cusco. Many skilled artisans, metalsmiths, weavers, potters were relocated to serve the Inca state. Chan Chan was not razed, instead, it was largely abandoned. Without its ruling elite and specialist workforce, maintenance of the vast irrigation network faltered in places. Adobe structures, already vulnerable to rare but devastating El Niño rains, began to erode more quickly once human care diminished. Within a few generations, the once thrumming city became a silent labyrinth of crumbling walls overtaken by sand. The Chimu collapse illustrates a different facet of civilizational endings, conquest and absorption by a rising power. The Inca did not exterminate the Chimu people. Many continued to live in the region, speaking their language for a time and preserving elements of craft tradition. Yet the distinctive Chimu political structure, with its divine kingship tied to sequential palace compounds, its coastal focus, its independent imperial reach, ceased to exist as a sovereign entity. Within decades, the Inca imprint dominated the coast until, in turn, the Spanish arrival in the following century brought yet another layer of transformation. Further north, along the desert coast of what is now northern Peru and southern Ecuador, the earlier Moche civilization had followed its own arc of rise and dissolution centuries before. Between roughly 100 and 700 of our Common Era, the Moche built towering adobe pyramids such as the Huaca del Sol and Huaca de la Luna, produced realistic portrait vessels, and conducted elaborate sacrificial rituals. Their irrigation systems transformed barren valleys into productive farmland, yet by the 8th century, signs of stress accumulated. Evidence from river sediments and ice cores points to a series of powerful El Niño events, intense warm phases that brought catastrophic floods followed by long droughts. Massive floods damaged canals and fields. Prolonged dry periods afterward reduced river flow. Skeletal remains show increased signs of nutritional stress and disease. Warfare appears to have intensified, with defensive fortifications appearing and depictions of combat growing more common in art. One by one, major centers were abandoned or violently destroyed. The coherent Moche style in ceramics and architecture faded, replaced by simpler local traditions that blended with incoming influences from the highlands. Here again we see environmental variability, extreme swings between flood and drought, pushing against the limits of even the most carefully engineered agricultural systems. When the rains and rivers became too erratic, the surpluses needed to sustain priests, warriors, artisans, and monumental construction could no longer be reliably produced. Populations dispersed or reorganized under different leadership, leaving the grand huacas to weather slowly under sun and occasional deluge. As these images of silent adobe citadels along desert shores, of the Nile's diminished floods, of once mighty pharaohs giving way to foreign kings, settle quietly around you like the hush that follows the last note of a distant song, we recognize once more the recurring theme. Whether through gradual environmental drift, sudden climatic shocks, overextension of resources, internal discord, or the rise of stronger neighbors, the elaborate arrangements that allow large, complex societies to flourish carry within them points of vulnerability. No civilization has escaped this truth entirely. In the calm hours still stretching before us, we will continue to follow these endings into other eras and regions, each one adding its own soft layer to our understanding of how human endeavors, however grand, eventually yield to time's patient current. For now, let your breathing slow, let these stories rest lightly upon you, and allow the night to draw you gently deeper into peace. As the gentle hush of deserted coastal cities and the slow retreat of once mighty rivers lingers in the quiet spaces of your mind, we sense how the endings we have traced thus far reveal a recurring softness in the fabric of human endeavor. Societies that mastered deserts with canals, highlands with terraces, or great rivers with monumental ambition still found themselves gradually or suddenly yielding when the supporting conditions, water, whether internal harmony or external balance, shifted beyond recovery. These patterns do not cease with the ancient world. They unfold across later centuries, in empires that span continents and eras, each one carrying forward echoes of the same quiet vulnerabilities. Let us now allow our thoughts to wander westward once more, this time to the vast Andean highlands where the Inca Empire, known to its people as Tawantinsuyu, rose to breathtaking scale. From the early 13th century of our Common Era, beginning in the Cusco Valley, this society expanded with extraordinary speed and organization. By the early 16th century, it stretched along the Pacific coast and deep into the mountains, encompassing what are now parts of Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, and Colombia, an area larger than many modern nations. The Inca engineered one of the most extensive road networks in the ancient world, thousands of kilometers of stone-paved paths linking distant provinces, with relay runners carrying messages and goods across rugged terrain in days rather than weeks. They built terraced fields on steep slopes to grow maize, potatoes, quinoa, and other crops, creating microclimates that sustained dense populations even at high altitudes. Storehouses dotted the landscape, filled with preserved food against lean years. Administrators used knotted cords called quipus to record tribute, census data, and labor obligations with remarkable precision. A centralized authority, embodied in the Sapa Inca as a divine ruler, coordinated labor through the Mita system, drawing people from communities for public works, military service, or temple duties. Cities like Cusco gleamed with finely fitted stone walls, golden ornaments, and temples dedicated to Inti, the sun god. Yet this immense and carefully integrated empire unraveled with startling rapidity in the early 16th century. The process began even before foreign ships appeared on the horizon. Around 1525 to 1528, a devastating epidemic, likely smallpox, carried southward from earlier European contact in the Caribbean and Mesoamerica, swept through the Andes. The disease arrived faster than any traveler, spreading along trade routes and claiming lives in staggering numbers. The reigning Sapa Inca, Huayna Capac, succumbed, along with his designated heir. Without a clear successor, the empire fractured into civil war between two of his sons, Huascar, based in Cusco with support from the traditional heartland, and Atahualpa, commanding loyal forces in the northern provinces from Quito. Armies clashed across mountains and valleys for several years, draining resources, disrupting agriculture and supply lines, and leaving communities exhausted and divided. Fields lay untended in places, storehouses depleted, and resentment grew among recently incorporated groups who had never fully accepted Inca rule. Into this moment of profound weakness arrived Francisco Pizarro and a small band of Spanish conquistadors in 1532. Landing on the northern coast, they advanced inland with steel weapons, horses, gunpowder, and armor, technologies unknown in the Andes. The Inca military, formidable with slings, clubs, and bronze-tipped spears, had no experience countering mounted cavalry or firearms. At Cajamarca, Pizarro's force ambushed and captured Atahualpa, who had just emerged victorious in the Civil War. Held for ransom, the emperor ordered vast quantities of gold and silver brought from across the empire. Yet after the treasure arrived, Atahualpa was executed in 1533 on charges of treason and idolatry. With the divine ruler gone, central authority dissolved further. Spanish forces marched on Cusco, installing a puppet emperor while facing sporadic resistance. Diseases continued to ravage populations already weakened by war and upheaval. By the 1570s, after the final holdouts in remote strongholds like Vilcabamba were subdued, the Inca political and administrative system had ceased to function as an independent entity. The people remained, many blending Inca traditions with new influences under colonial rule, but the empire, with its unified roads, terraces, quipus, and sun-worshipping state, had faded into memory and ruin. This ending highlights yet another pathway, the compounding of internal division and biological catastrophe, followed by external conquest. The Inca had built resilience through storage, roads, and labor rotation. Yet when epidemics struck an unexposed population and ignited succession strife, the tightly centralized structure became a liability rather than a strength. Once fractured, it could not withstand a determined intruder wielding superior weaponry and exploiting alliances with discontented local groups. Drifting now across oceans to the Mediterranean heartland, we come to one of the most extensively chronicled of all civilizational arcs, the Roman Empire. Emerging from a small city-state on the Tiber around the 8th century before our Common Era, Rome grew through conquest, alliance, and assimilation into a vast dominion that, at its height in the 2nd century of our Common Era, encircled the Mediterranean Sea and extended northward into Britain, westward to the Atlantic, eastward to Mesopotamia, and southward deep into North Africa. Roads paved with stone linked distant provinces, aqueducts carried water to burgeoning cities, legions enforced order and built frontier defenses, A common legal system, coinage, and Latin language fostered unity across diverse peoples. Emperors from Augustus onward presided over an era of relative stability known as the Pax Romana, during which trade flourished, cities expanded, and monumental architecture, colosseums, baths, temples, proclaimed enduring power. Yet by the 3rd century, cracks appeared and widened. Economic strains mounted as conquest slowed and tribute from new territories diminished. Reliance on slave labor in agriculture and mining created inefficiencies and social tensions, while inflation eroded the value of currency through repeated debasement. The empire grew too large for centralized control, communications lagged, corruption spread in distant provinces, and local elites increasingly prioritized their own interests. Military pressures intensified from multiple directions. Germanic tribes along the Rhine and Danube frontiers, Parthians and later Sassanids in the east, nomadic groups in North Africa. The army, once a professional force loyal to the state, became politicized. Emperors were frequently raised and deposed by legions, leading to near-constant civil wars in the 3rd century. Plagues, including the Antonine Plague in the late 2nd century and the Cyprian Plague in the mid-3rd, swept through dense urban populations and armies, reducing manpower and disrupting production. Attempts at reform, Diocletian's division of the empire into eastern and western halves around 285, Constantine's establishment of a new capital at Constantinople in 330, and efforts to stabilize currency and administration, bought time but could not reverse deeper trends. The western half grew poorer and more vulnerable as resources shifted eastward. Barbarian groups, pushed by migrations and climate pressures, crossed frontiers in greater numbers. Some were settled as foederati allies, others raided or seized territory. In 410, the Visigoths under Alaric sacked Rome itself, an unthinkable humiliation. Vandals, Suebi, and others carved out kingdoms in Spain and North Africa. By the mid-5th century, the Western emperor ruled little beyond Italy. In 476, the Germanic leader Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, sending the imperial insignia to Constantinople as a gesture of nominal unity under the Eastern emperor. The Western Empire did not vanish in flames, but dissolved gradually into successor kingdoms where Roman law, language, and infrastructure persisted in altered forms. The Eastern Empire endured for another millennium, yet the unified Roman world of antiquity had quietly come to an end in the West. These later stories of rapid imperial expansion undone by epidemic and division in the Andes, of centuries-long erosion through economic strain, military overreach, and frontier pressures in Rome, carry the same understated truth. No matter how vast the roads, how precise the administration, or how formidable the legends, societies rest upon balances that can tilt under sustained stress. As these reflections settle like the slow accumulation of dust over marble forums and terraced slopes, we feel the weight of time's patient current carrying all things onward. In the peaceful expanse still before us, we will trace further endings into other lands and ages, each adding its gentle layer to the long, unhurried narrative. For now, let your thoughts rest here in the quiet twilight of empires, breathing easily as the night deepens around you. As the faint outlines of fallen empires, terrace slopes left untended in the Andes, marble forums slowly claimed by moss and time in the Mediterranean, continue to rest softly in the quiet reaches of your awareness, we feel once more how each ending, whether swift or drawn across centuries, carries the same understated reminder. That human achievement, no matter how vast or beautifully ordered, exists within limits set by nature, circumstance, and the choices of those who inherit what came before. The stories do not end with Rome or Tawantinsuyu. New centers of power and culture rose in their wake in different landscapes and under different stars, only to meet their own gentle or abrupt conclusions in turn. Let us now allow our thoughts to drift eastward across the steppes and into the heart of Central Asia, where the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan and his successors became, for a brief but extraordinary moment, the largest contiguous land empire in history. Beginning in the early 13th century of our Common Era, nomadic tribes unified under a single leader forged an unprecedented domain. From the Pacific shores of China to the edges of Eastern Europe, from Siberia's frozen taiga to the Persian Gulf, the Mongols established control through swift cavalry, disciplined organization, psychological warfare, and a willingness to incorporate skilled administrators and artisans from conquered lands. They created the Pax Mongolica, a period of relative safety along trade routes that allowed merchants, scholars, ideas, technologies, and diseases to move more freely than ever before across Eurasia. Paper money circulated in China under Mongol rule, postal relay stations spanned thousands of kilometers, censuses and legal codes were imposed with remarkable efficiency. Cities such as Karakoram served as temporary capitals, while regional khanates, Ilkhanate in Persia, Golden Horde in the Russian steppes, Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China, administered distant territories with a degree of coordination previously unimaginable. Yet this colossal structure, built so rapidly, proved fragile when measured against the long patience of time. By the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the unified empire had already fragmented into semi-independent khanates, each pursuing its own interests. Succession disputes, palace intrigues, and rivalries among descendants eroded central authority. The sheer scale of the empire made sustained communication and control increasingly difficult. Distances that once seemed conquerable with fast horses became barriers when loyalty waned. In China, the Yuan dynasty faced mounting resistance from Han Chinese populations who resented foreign rule, heavy taxation, natural disasters, floods of the Yellow River, famines, and the spread of millenarian movements promising the restoration of native rule. Rebellions multiplied in the 1350s and 1360s until in 1368 the Ming dynasty overthrew the Mongols in China, driving them back to the steppes. The Ilkhanate in Persia collapsed even earlier, around 1335, after a series of weak rulers, civil wars, and the devastating arrival of the Black Death, which swept through trade routes and decimated urban populations already strained by earlier conflicts. The Golden Horde endured longer but gradually lost cohesion as Russian principalities grew stronger and paid less tribute. By the 15th century, it had splintered into smaller khanates. The Chagatai Khanate fragmented amid nomadic rivalries and Timurid incursions. Environmental factors added their quiet pressure. The Mongol conquests had depended heavily on the steppes' grasses, supporting vast herds of horses essential for military mobility. Paleoclimatic records from tree rings, lake sediments, and ice cores indicate that the 14th century brought a cooler, drier phase across much of Inner Asia, the onset of what some call the Little Ice Age in parts of the northern hemisphere. Reduced rainfall diminished pasture lands, herds shrank, the logistical foundation of nomadic warfare weakened. Combined with plague mortality, economic disruption from broken trade routes, and political infighting, these changes accelerated the empire's dissolution. The Mongols did not disappear as a people. Their descendants continued as Kazakhs, Mongols, Kalmyks, and others, preserving languages, pastoral traditions, and memories of past greatness. Yet the grand imperial framework, with its unified continent-spanning Yam postal system, and enforced peace across diverse realms, quietly unraveled over the course of roughly 2 centuries, leaving behind ruined palaces, abandoned relay stations, and chronicles that still speak of a time when one family's ambition briefly joined East and West. Continuing our calm traversal, we now turn southward to the African continent, to the region of the Sahel and the savannas where several powerful states rose and fell across the medieval and early modern periods. One of the most renowned was the Mali Empire, which reached its zenith in the 14th century under rulers such as Mansa Musa. Centered along the upper Niger River and extending westward to the Atlantic coast and eastward into the bend of the river, Mali controlled some of the richest gold fields in the medieval world. gold dust, traded northward across the Sahara in caravans of camels, funded magnificent mosques and universities in cities like Timbuktu and Jenne. Scholars from North Africa and beyond studied manuscripts on mathematics, astronomy, law, and medicine. Mansa Musa's famous pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, during which he distributed so much gold that it temporarily depressed prices in Cairo, became legendary testimony to Mali's wealth and reach. The empire maintained order through a professional army, provincial governors, and a system of tribute that supported the royal court and religious institutions. Yet by the late 15th and early 16th centuries, Mali began to contract. Succession struggles weakened central authority after the death of strong rulers. Vassal states, including the rising Songhai to the east, asserted greater independence. Raids by nomadic groups from the north disrupted trans-Saharan trade routes. Gold production shifted southward as older mines depleted and new sources were exploited elsewhere. Environmental stress may have played a role as well. Sediment records from the Niger River suggest periods of reduced rainfall in the Sahel during these centuries, which would have affected agriculture in the riverine zones and pasture for cattle herders who supplied the empire's cavalry. By the mid-16th century, Songhai had eclipsed Mali as the dominant power in the region, absorbing many of its territories and continuing the tradition of Timbuktu as a center of learning. Mali itself survived as a smaller kingdom but never regained its former scale or influence. Songhai, in turn, followed a similar trajectory. Under Askia Mohammed in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, it became perhaps the largest empire in West African history, stretching from the Atlantic to the borders of Hausaland and controlling both gold and salt trade. Yet internal divisions, rivalries among military commanders, tensions between Muslim elites and traditionalist groups eroded unity. In 1591, a Moroccan expeditionary force armed with arquebuses crossed the Sahara and decisively defeated Songhai at the Battle of Tondibai. The Moroccan occupation was short-lived, but it shattered Songhai's centralized structure. The empire fragmented into smaller states, trade routes shifted, Timbuktu's scholarly community declined as patronage dried up. Once again, a combination of military defeat, internal weakness, and changing economic patterns brought a great Sahelian power to its end, not through total destruction, but through gradual dispersal and absorption into new political arrangements. These West African examples illustrate yet another facet: the vulnerability of trade-based empires when the commodities they controlled lost value, routes were disrupted, or external powers with new technologies intervened. Gold and salt had sustained Mali and Songhai for centuries, yet when mines played out, rains faltered, or gunpowder entered the equation, the delicate balance tipped. Populations adapted, cities persisted in diminished form, traditions endured in oral histories and manuscripts, but the imperial grandeur faded into the savanna winds. As these images of wind swept relay posts on the Mongolian steppe, of silent minarets along the Niger where scholars once debated under lamplight, settle like the soft close of a long evening, we recognize again the patient rhythm at work. Empires expand when conditions favor them. They contract when those conditions change, whether through climate, disease, succession, overreach, or the arrival of stronger rivals. In the peaceful hours still ahead, our journey will carry us into other regions and eras, each story adding its calm, reflective note to the unbroken melody of rise and fall. For now, let your breathing deepen, let these distant horizons rest lightly within you, and allow the night to wrap its gentle quiet around every thought. As the distant echoes of steppe, relay posts, and Sahelian minarets fade into the deepening stillness around you, we allow the mind to continue its gentle drift. The endings we have followed so far, whether through drought settling over highland fields, epidemic moving faster than armies, or trade routes shifting like sand under new winds, carry forward the same quiet certainty. that every structure raised by human hands and minds, no matter how vast or carefully balanced, eventually meets conditions it cannot fully master. Time does not hurry these changes, it simply waits, patient and unyielding, until small stresses accumulate into transformations too great to reverse. Let us now turn our thoughts northward once more, this time to the cold northern forests, river systems, and open plains where the Kievan Rus principalities gave way over centuries, to the rise and eventual fragmentation of the Grand Duchy of Moscow and the sprawling Tsardom that followed. From the 9th century of our common era, Slavic, Finnic, and Varangian Viking peoples along the Dnieper and Volga rivers formed a loose federation centered on Kiev. Trade flowed between the Baltic and the Black Sea, furs, honey, wax, amber moving south, silk, spices, silver coming north. Orthodox Christianity, adopted in 988 under Vladimir the Great, provided a shared religious and cultural framework. Princes ruled semi-independent city-states, Kiev, Novgorod, Chernigov, Vladimir Suzdal, bound by kinship, tribute, and occasional alliances against steppe nomads such as the Pechenegs and Cumans. The Mongol invasion of the 13th century changed everything. In 1237–1240, Batu Khan's armies swept through the Rus lands, sacking Kiev in 1240 and reducing many wooden cities to ash. The surviving principalities became vassals of the Golden Horde, paying tribute yasak in silver and furs and supplying troops when called. For over 2 centuries, the Tatar yoke shaped political life. Princes received Yarlich's charters of rule from Sarai, the Horde's capital on the Volga. Rivalries were settled or exacerbated by Horde intervention. Cultural and economic stagnation set in as resources flowed outward and defensive walls replaced open trade. Yet within this long subordination, seeds of change grew. The northeastern principalities, especially Moscow, gradually gained advantage. Ivan I Khalida, the moneybag in the early 14th century, collected tribute for the Horde while quietly expanding his own lands and influence. His successors continued the strategy, marrying into Horde nobility when useful, playing rival princes against each other, and steadily annexing neighboring territories. By the late 15th century, the balance had shifted. The Golden Horde itself had fragmented into smaller khanates: Crimean, Kazan, Astrakhan, Sibir. Ivan III the Great, ruling 1462–1505, refused tribute in 1480 at the Symbolic, standing on the Ugra River, facing down the last great Horde army without battle as both sides withdrew. Moscow absorbed Novgorod in 1478, Tver in 1485, and other principalities through war, purchase, or inheritance. The title Tsar of all Rus emerged under Ivan IV the Terrible in 1547, signaling a claim to unified sovereignty. Yet the very success of this consolidation carried the seeds of later strain. Ivan IV's Oprichnina, a state within a state marked by terror against boyars, weakened the old nobility and disrupted local administration. The time of troubles, 1598–1613, followed his death. Famine caused by several consecutive poor harvests, possibly linked to the onset of colder, wetter conditions in the early Little Ice Age, dynastic vacuum after the death of Ivan's feeble-minded son, foreign invasions by Poles and Swedes, and widespread banditry. Moscow was occupied, pretenders appeared, peasant uprisings flared. Only in 1613 did the Zemsky Sabor elect Michael Romanov, founding a new dynasty that restored order. The Romanov era saw expansion eastward into Siberia, southward toward the Black Sea, and westward into Polish-Lithuanian territories, creating an empire that by the 18th century stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific. Yet internal contradictions persisted. Serfdom, hardened into near slavery to support a military nobility, created deep social tensions. Periodic famines, some exacerbated by cold spells and failed harvests, sparked unrest. The empire's vast size demanded enormous resources to govern. Corruption, distance, and inefficiency eroded central control in the provinces. By the early 20th century, military defeats, Crimean War 1853–1856, Russo-Japanese War 1904–1905, rapid but uneven industrialization, peasant land hunger, and the strains of World War I combined with revolutionary ideologies to bring the monarchy down in 1917. The subsequent civil war, foreign interventions, and reorganization under Soviet rule marked the end of the old imperial order, not as a sudden collapse but as a protracted transformation across decades of upheaval. This long arc from fragmented principalities under steppe overlordship, through patient accumulation of power in Moscow, to continental empire and finally dissolution amid modern pressures, shows how endurance across centuries can still end when accumulated stresses, environmental, social, military, ideological, exceed adaptive capacity. The people persisted, languages evolved, orthodox faith endured in new forms, yet the political and social structures that defined each phase gradually gave way to something different. Shifting our calm gaze now to the island kingdoms of Southeast Asia, we find another sequence of rises and gentle fadings. The Khmer Empire, centered at Angkor in what is now Cambodia, reached its peak between the 9th and 13th centuries of our Common Era. Under kings such as Suryavarman II and Jayavarman VII, the Khmer constructed the world's largest pre-industrial religious complex, Angkor Wat, and the surrounding baray reservoirs, temples, and hydraulic city. An elaborate system of canals, reservoirs, baray, and rice paddies supported a dense population in a region of seasonal monsoons. Trade brought spices, aromatics, and precious stones. Monumental stone carvings depicted epics, processions, and divine kingship. The empire's influence extended into parts of modern Thailand, Laos, and southern Vietnam. Yet by the 14th and 15th centuries, Angkor entered terminal decline. Inscriptions grow sparse after the late 13th century. Monumental construction ceased. The capital was abandoned by the early 15th century, with power shifting southward to Phnom Penh and later other centers. Multiple factors converged. Prolonged dry periods, evidenced in tree ring records from Southeast Asia and sediment cores from the Tonle Sap, disrupted the monsoon-dependent agriculture. The massive hydraulic network, while ingenious, required constant maintenance. Silting, breaches, or reduced inflow during drier decades would have diminished its effectiveness. Deforestation for rice fields and fuel may have altered local rainfall patterns and increased erosion into canals. At the same time, military pressure mounted from the rising Thai kingdom of Ayutthaya to the west. Thai chronicles record several sieges of Angkor, including a major sack in 1431. Khmer elites may have relocated southward to more defensible or economically viable locations near the Mekong Delta. Malaria and other diseases likely increased in the densely populated, water-rich lowlands as maintenance lapsed. The Khmer people did not vanish. Their descendants continued and still continue in Cambodia, preserving language, Theravada Buddhism, which gradually supplanted earlier Hindu-Buddhist traditions and cultural memory. Yet the centralized, monumental civilization of Angkor, with its god-kings and vast water management empire, slowly dissolved into jungle and rice fields. Further south in maritime Southeast Asia, the Thalassocratic Empire of Srivijaya, 7th to 13th centuries, and later Majapahit, 13th to 16th centuries, followed parallel paths. Srivijaya controlled the Strait of Malacca, extracting tolls from passing ships and spreading Mahayana Buddhism and Sanskrit culture across the archipelago. Majapahit, based in eastern Java, expanded through naval expeditions and marriage alliances, its golden age under Hayam Wuruk and Gajah Mada celebrated in epic poetry. Both relied on control of sea lanes, tribute in spices and forest products, and prestige goods from China and India. Yet changing trade patterns, especially the rise of direct Chinese voyages under Zheng He in the early 15th century, followed by Portuguese entry into the Indian Ocean after 1498, shifted economic gravity. Islam spread peacefully along trade routes, eroding Hindu-Buddhist legitimacy in many ports. internal succession disputes, volcanic eruptions disrupting Javanese agriculture, and military defeats, notably by the rising Sultanate of Demak, fragmented Majapahit's authority. By the 16th century, its once dominant mandala of vassal states had dissolved into smaller sultanates and trading polities. These Southeast Asian examples again illustrate how societies finely tuned to specific environmental rhythms, monsoon cycles, river flows, sea trade winds, could falter when those rhythms changed or when external actors, Thai kingdoms, Muslim traders, European gunpowder navies, altered the regional balance. The stone cities and hydraulic wonders did not disappear overnight. They were slowly reclaimed by forest, river, or new political centers, while the underlying populations adapted to transformed realities. As these images of moss-covered baray now silent under monsoon clouds, of wooden palaces in northern forests overtaken by time and snow, settle like the final breath of a long-held sigh, we sense the unbroken continuity beneath every ending. The land endures, people carry forward pieces of what came before, yet the particular forms of organization and belief that once defined a civilization yield, generation by generation, to what follows. In the calm expanse still stretching before us, we will continue tracing these soft transitions into other times and places, each one inviting deeper rest as the night carries every thought gently onward. For now, let your eyelids grow heavy. Let these stories breathe quietly within you and allow peace to wrap itself around you completely. As the soft impressions of Angkor's silent reservoirs and Moscow's snow-dusted wooden Kremlins linger like the last traces of mist at dawn, we permit the mind to continue its unhurried passage. The endings already visited, whether shaped by monsoon failure, steppe drought, plague across trade roads, or the slow fraying of tribute systems, carry the same gentle insistence. No arrangement of power, belief, or labor has ever proven permanent. Each civilization in its time seemed the natural order of things to those who lived within it. Each, in turn, yielded to pressures that accumulated beyond the horizon of any single lifetime. The pattern holds steady as we move forward into more recent centuries, where societies grew larger, more interconnected, and in some ways more fragile under the weight of their own complexity. Let us now allow our reflections to settle upon the islands of the Caribbean and the broad mainland territories where the Taino, Arawak, and other indigenous societies once flourished before European contact transformed the region. From roughly the time of Christ onward, the Taino people developed complex chiefdoms, cacicazgos, across the Greater Antilles, Cuba, Hispaniola, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and parts of the Bahamas. Villages of thatched bohios clustered around central plazas used for arrados, ceremonial dances and storytelling, ball games, and communal decision-making. They cultivated cassava, maize, sweet potatoes, beans, and cotton in canucos, raised mounds, managed forests for fruit trees, and harvested the surrounding seas with dugout canoes and nets. A sophisticated social hierarchy emerged, caciques chiefs advised by Netanos nobles and bohiques shamans who interpreted dreams, healed, and communed with spirits embodied in zemis, sacred objects. Trade-linked islands, gold nuggets, cotton, parrots, guanin, a gold-copper owl, flowing along sea routes that connected even to the mainland. Population estimates for Hispaniola alone at the end of the 15th century range from several 100,000 to over 1 million, sustained by fertile soils and reliable rainfall. The arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492 initiated a cascade of changes that, within a single human lifetime, brought this world to an end. The first decade saw violent clashes, forced labor under the encomienda system, and above all the introduction of old-world diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, to which the island populations had no immunity. Mortality reached catastrophic levels. Contemporary Spanish accounts, even when adjusted for possible exaggeration, describe villages emptied within years. On Hispaniola, where Columbus established La Isabela and later Santo Domingo, the Taino population plummeted from hundreds of thousands to perhaps 30,000 by 1518 and continued downward thereafter. Encomienda labor demands, mining for gold in streams already nearly exhausted, building settlements, growing food for Europeans, combined with malnutrition, overwork, and despair to accelerate collapse. Resistance flared, most notably under Cacique Enriquillo in the 1520s and 1530s, but was eventually subdued through negotiation rather than annihilation. By the mid-16th century, the distinct Taino societies, with their casagazgos, zemi-cults, arredos, and sea-spanning networks, had ceased to exist as independent entities. Survivors blended into emerging mestizo and African-descended populations under Spanish colonial rule. Words, agricultural techniques, cassava processing, and place names persisted, yet the organized chiefdoms, ceremonial plazas, and autonomous communities dissolved into memory. Further south, across the Isthmus of Panama and down the Andean spine, the story of the Muisca Chibcha Confederation offers another quiet parallel. Flourishing between roughly 600 and 1600 of our common era in the high savannas of what is now central Colombia, the Muisca built a densely settled agricultural society. They terraced hillsides, grew potatoes, maize, quinoa, and beans, and managed large salt mines whose product was traded widely. Goldworking reached exquisite levels, tunjos, votive figures, nose rings, breastplates, used in rituals rather than as currency. The society organized into loose confederations led by Zipas, southern rulers, and Zacs, northern rulers, with religious authority vested in the Araka of Sugamuxi and other priests. Lake Guatavita became legendary for the El Dorado rite, a chief coated in gold dust rafted to the center to offer treasures before diving in. Population in the core region may have reached several 100,000, supported by intensive farming and inter-community exchange. Spanish arrival in the 1530s under Gonzalo Jiménez de Quesada shattered this world with terrifying speed. Disease preceded armies. Smallpox epidemics in the late 1520s and early 1530s had already weakened communities. The Spanish, few in number but armed with steel, horses, and gunpowder, exploited existing rivalries. Zipa and Zac were already at war and captured key leaders. Bogotá, then Bacatá, fell in 1538. Tunya followed. Encomiendas were granted to conquistadors, forcing Muisca labor in mines initially for gold, later emeralds and haciendas. Riscardo's reservations were later established, but land loss, tribute demands, and continued epidemics eroded the old social order. By the 17th century, the Muisca language was in steep decline, traditional religious practices suppressed under Christian conversion, and the confederation structure replaced by colonial cabildos and Spanish administration. The people endured. Many Colombians carry Muisca ancestry, but the autonomous chiefdoms, gold ritual complex, and salt-based economy faded into colonial patterns. These Caribbean and northern Andean cases reveal a particularly swift form of civilizational ending. Encounter with a biologically and technologically disparate outsider, followed by pandemic mortality, violent subjugation, forced labor, and cultural suppression. The societies did not collapse from internal exhaustion alone. An external shock of unprecedented scale overwhelmed defenses no society could have prepared for. Survivors adapted, intermingled, preserved fragments of language and custom, yet the world they had known, with its plazas, zemis, tunjos, and sea-linked villages, vanished within generations. Continuing our serene progression, we now cross the Atlantic to the British Isles, where the medieval and early modern kingdoms of England, Scotland, and Ireland underwent their own long transformations. England, emerging from Anglo-Saxon kingdoms after the Norman conquest of 1066, developed a centralized monarchy, common law, parliament, and a wool-based export economy by the late Middle Ages. The Black Death of 1348-1350 killed perhaps 30 to 50% of the population, shifting labor relations and weakening feudal ties. The Wars of the Roses, 1455–1487, exhausted noble houses and paved the way for Tudor consolidation under Henry VII and Henry VIII. The dissolution of the monasteries, 1536–1541, transferred vast lands to the crown and gentry, funding naval expansion and altering rural society. Yet the English state endured, evolving through civil war, 1642–1651, Restoration and the Glorious Revolution, 1688, into a constitutional monarchy with growing commercial and imperial reach. Scotland followed a different but parallel path. From the unification under Kenneth Mac Alpin in the 9th century, it developed a distinct Gaelic Norse Anglo-Norman culture with burghs, clans, and a parliament. The Wars of Independence, 1296–1328 and 1332–1357, forged national identity against English domination. The 16th century Reformation introduced Presbyterianism, while the 1603 Union of Crowns under James VII began a slow convergence with England. The 1707 Act of Union created Great Britain, ending an independent Scottish Parliament in exchange for economic integration and colonial opportunities. Highland clan society persisted until the Jacobite risings of 1715 and 1745 were crushed, followed by the Highland clearances, late 18th to mid-19th centuries. Landlords evicted tenants for sheep farming, driving mass emigration to North America, Australia, and urban lowlands. Gaelic language and traditional social structures declined sharply. Scotland did not fall as an independent polity in the sense of violent conquest. It merged into a larger union, losing political sovereignty while retaining cultural distinctiveness that later re-emerged in modern devolution. Ireland's trajectory was more traumatic. Gaelic lordships, organized around kinship and pastoralism, faced successive English incursions from the 12th century Norman invasion onward. The Tudor conquest, 16th century, and Cromwellian campaigns, 1649–1653, confiscated vast estates, transplanting Protestant settlers and marginalizing Catholic Gaelic elites. Penal laws in the 18th century restricted Catholic land ownership, education, and office holding. The Great Famine of 1845–1852, triggered by potato blight but worsened by export of other foods during British rule, killed roughly 1 million and drove another million to emigrate. Population halved within decades. Irish language use collapsed outside Western pockets. While Ireland retained cultural continuity, music, storytelling, Catholicism, the old Gaelic order of tanistry, bards, and independent kingdoms was effectively ended by conquest, plantation, and economic catastrophe. These British Isles examples illustrate endings through absorption, constitutional evolution, clearance, and colonial subjugation, rather than sudden catastrophe. Political forms changed, kingdoms became unions, clans became tenants or emigrants. While populations persisted, languages retreated, and identities reshaped themselves under new conditions. As these reflections of empty bohios overtaken by cane fields, silent Guatavita still holding its sunken gold, cleared highland glens now grazed by sheep, settle like the slow closing of a very old book, we feel again the patient continuity beneath every transformation. Societies adapt until they cannot. Then something new emerges from what remains. In the tranquil hours still before us, our journey will carry onward into other lands and nearer times, each story inviting the mind to rest more deeply as the night draws its quiet curtain around every thought. For now, breathe slowly, let these distant endings rest lightly within you, and allow peace to carry you gently forward. As the faint traces of cleared glens, abandoned bohios, and silent Guatavita waters rest like the final notes of a very long lullaby, we permit the mind to drift onward without hurry. The endings we have followed through epidemic waves that emptied islands, conquests that reshaped highlands, clearances that emptied valleys, unions that folded kingdoms into larger entities, carry forward the same soft certainty. Every way of life, however deeply rooted or widely extended, eventually encounters limits it cannot indefinitely outlast. The land remembers, the people adapt and carry fragments forward, yet the particular shapes of society, belief, and power quietly dissolve into what comes next. We now turn our gentle attention to regions and eras closer still to the present, where industrialization, global trade, colonial systems, and modern states rose with unprecedented speed, only to meet their own slow or sudden transformations. Let us begin with the vast colonial empires of Western Europe that, from the 16th through the 20th centuries, spanned oceans and continents in ways earlier powers could scarcely have imagined. The Spanish Empire, born from the union of Castile and Aragon and propelled by the 1492 voyage of Columbus, grew to control much of the Americas, the Philippines, parts of Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, during the Iberian Union 1580–1640, and scattered outposts in Africa and Asia. Silver from Potosi and Zacatecas flooded European markets, funding armies, palaces, and the Counter-Reformation. Viceroys governed from Mexico City and Lima. The Casa de Contratación regulated transatlantic trade. The Catholic Church established missions, universities, and inquisitorial tribunals. Yet over 3 centuries, this sprawling dominion gradually contracted. The Dutch Revolt, 1568–1648, and the loss of the northern Netherlands drained resources. The 30 Years' War, 1618–1648, exhausted the treasury. Defeat in the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701–1714, transferred European holdings to other dynasties. In the Americas, Enlightenment ideas, Creole resentment of peninsular privilege, economic restrictions, and inspiration from the American and French revolutions fueled independence movements. Between 1810 and 1825, most of Spanish South and Central America broke away. Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Peru, Mexico, and others, through wars led by figures such as Bolivar, San Martin, and Hidalgo. Cuba and Puerto Rico remained until 1898, when defeat in the Spanish-American War ended overseas empire. The Philippines followed the same year. Spain itself endured as a nation-state, its language and Catholic heritage spreading globally, yet the imperial structure, with its viceroyalties, silver fleets, and monopoly trade, faded into history, undone by overextension, fiscal strain, Enlightenment critiques, and Creole nationalism. The Portuguese Empire followed a similar arc, though longer in duration and more maritime in character. From the early 15th century explorations along the African coast, Portugal established feitorias, trading forts in West Africa, seized Ceuta 1415, rounded the Cape of Good Hope 1498, and founded Goa 1510, Malacca 1511, Macau 1557, and Brazil 1500 onward. Control of the Indian Ocean spice trade, Brazilian sugar and gold, and African slave routes sustained Lisbon's wealth for centuries. Yet competition from the Dutch, who captured Malacca in 1641, and much of Ceylon, English and French eroded holdings. The 1755 Lisbon earthquake and ensuing financial crisis weakened the metropole. Brazilian independence came peacefully in 1822 under Pedro I, son of the Portuguese king. African colonies Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau lasted until the 1970s, relinquished after the Carnation Revolution ended the authoritarian Estado Novo regime and its colonial wars. Like Spain, Portugal survived as a European nation, its language now spoken by over 260 million people, yet the seaborne empire with its carracks, feitorias, and viceregal administration quietly dissolved across 4 centuries. The British Empire, reaching its greatest extent after World War I when it governed roughly a quarter of the world's land and population, followed its own extended twilight. From tentative footholds in the early 17th century, Jamestown 1607, Barbados 1627, Bombay and Madras, Britain expanded through commerce, settlement, conquest, and treaty. The East India Company ruled large parts of the subcontinent until the 1857 uprising led to direct crown rule. Canada, Australia, New Zealand became settler dominions with responsible government by the late 19th century. African colonies multiplied after the 1884–1885 Berlin Conference. Yet 2 world wars drained resources, the Great Depression exposed economic vulnerabilities, anti-colonial nationalism grew in intensity, Gandhi's non-violent campaigns in India, Nkrumah's independence movement in Ghana, Kenyatta in Kenya, Sukarno in Indonesia, transferred from Dutch rule. India and Pakistan gained independence in 1947, followed by Burma 1948, Ceylon 1948, Ghana 1957, and dozens more through the 1960s and 1970s. The Suez Crisis 1956 marked a public acknowledgement of diminished power. Hong Kong reverted to China in 1997. The empire did not collapse in a single catastrophe. It devolved through negotiated transfers, occasional conflict, and the simple reality that maintaining global dominion became unsustainable after the mid-20th century's economic and moral shifts. Britain endured its institutions, language, and legal traditions, now global common property, yet the imperial edifice with its viceroys, governor-generals, and red-coated garrisons faded into archival photographs and Commonwealth meetings. France's colonial empire traced a comparable path. After losing much of its first empire, Canada, Louisiana, parts of India in the 7 Years' War, 1756–1763, France rebuilt a second empire in the 19th century, Algeria 1830 onward, Indochina 1880s, West and Equatorial Africa, Madagascar, Pacific Islands. The mission civilisatrice justified administration through schools, railways, and assimilation policies, though practice often meant exploitation and forced labor. World War II accelerated change. Defeat in 1940 humiliated the metropole. Vichy collaboration and Free French resistance complicated legitimacy. Post-war nationalist movements, Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, the FLN in Algeria, proved unstoppable. Defeat at Dien Bien Phu 1954 ended French Indochina. The Algerian War 1954–1962 ended in independence after immense cost in lives and political crisis in France itself. Sub-Saharan colonies gained independence peacefully in 1960, the Year of Africa. France retained overseas departments, Martinique, Guadeloupe, Réunion, and influence through La Francophonie. Yet the centralized colonial administration, with its governors-general, Code de l'Indigenat, and extractive economies, gradually ceased to exist. These European colonial empires illustrate endings through decolonization, a process often gradual, sometimes violent, always shaped by the interplay of metropolitan exhaustion, wars, debt, domestic politics, colonial resistance, boycotts, strikes, guerrilla campaigns, shifting international norms, UN Charter, human rights discourse, and Cold War dynamics that made overt imperialism costly. The metropoles survived, often wealthier and more democratic than before, yet the global structure of direct rule over distant peoples quietly unraveled across the 20th century. As these reflections of empty viceregal palaces in Lima and Delhi, of flags lowered in Accra and Algiers one by one, settle like the slow falling of leaves at the end of a very long season, we recognize once more the patient rhythm that underlies every transition. Empires expand when conditions permit. They contract when those conditions change through fiscal limits, moral critique, military overstretch, or the simple assertion of self-determination by those once governed. In the calm hours still stretching before us, our journey will carry forward into other modern examples, each one adding its reflective note to the unending story of rise, endurance, and gentle yielding. For now, let your breathing slow even further. Let these images of departing governors and new national anthems rest softly within you, and allow the night to draw you deeper into its quiet embrace. As the quiet images of lowered colonial flags and emptied viceregal halls continue to settle like the final traces of twilight over open water, we allow the mind to drift onward without resistance or haste. The endings we have traced so far, whether through the patient withdrawal of imperial administration, the assertion of self-rule after generations of distant governance, or the simple exhaustion of resources needed to hold distant lands, carry the same understated truth, that even the most far-reaching systems of control and connection eventually reach a point where continuation becomes more costly than transformation. The pattern persists as we move into the most recent layers of history, where nation-states, ideological blocs, planned economies, and globalized industrial orders rose with extraordinary momentum, only to encounter their own slow unravelings or abrupt shifts in form. Let us now turn our gentle attention to the vast experiment in centralized planning and state-directed industrialization that defined the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics across most of the 20th century. Emerging from the ruins of the Russian Empire after revolutions in 1917, civil war, foreign intervention, and famine, the Soviet Union under Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, and their successors became the world's largest country by land area and the principal counterweight to Western capitalism during the Cold War. The Bolsheviks nationalized industry, collectivized agriculture, abolished private trade in key sectors, and launched five-year plans that transformed a largely agrarian society into an industrial and military superpower within a single generation. Steel mills rose in Magnitogorsk and Kuzbas, hydroelectric dams spanned the Dnieper and Volga, tractor plants fed mechanized state farms, and nuclear weapons balanced the American arsenal by 1949. Urbanization accelerated, literacy campaigns eradicated widespread illiteracy, women entered the workforce and professions in unprecedented numbers, spaceflight milestones, Sputnik in 1957, Gagarin's orbit in 1961 proclaimed technological parity. The multi-ethnic federation bound 15 republics through a shared ideology, centralized command economy, secret police apparatus, and a single communist party that brooked no organized opposition. Yet beneath the surface achievements, strains accumulated across decades. Collectivization in the late 1920s and early 1930s triggered resistance, sabotage, and the man-made famine of the Holodomor in Ukraine, 1930–1933, claiming millions of lives and leaving deep scars of mistrust. The Great Purge 1936–1938 eliminated perceived enemies within the party, military, and intelligentsia, decimating experienced leadership just before the German invasion of 1941. World War II cost an estimated 27 million Soviet lives, destroyed vast Western territories, yet victory in 1945 reinforced the system's legitimacy for a generation. Post-war reconstruction rebuilt cities and industries at enormous human cost, while the arms race and support for proxy conflicts drained resources from civilian sectors. By the 1960s and 1970s, growth slowed markedly. Central planning struggled with complexity, quotas encouraged quantity over quality, innovation lagged outside military and space sectors, consumer goods remained scarce or shoddy, and black markets filled gaps the state could not. Agricultural inefficiency persisted despite massive investment. Grain imports became routine by the 1970s. Environmental degradation, Aral Sea shrinkage from cotton irrigation, Chernobyl disaster in 1986 exposed the limits of unchecked industrial ambition. Brezhnev's long tenure, 1964–1982, became known as the era of stagnation. Corruption spread through nomenclatura networks, alcoholism rose, life expectancy plateaued or declined, and cynicism quietly replaced revolutionary fervor among many citizens. Andropov and Chernenko offered brief attempts at discipline, but real change arrived only with Gorbachev in 1985. Perestroika sought economic restructuring, limited market mechanisms, cooperatives, reduced central control, while Glasnost opened public discussion, released political prisoners, and loosened censorship. Yet liberalization unleashed forces the system could not contain. Nationalist movements revived in the Baltic republics, Caucasus, and Ukraine. Economic reforms caused shortages, inflation, and inequality without immediate benefits. The party lost its monopoly as alternative voices emerged. The August 1991 coup attempt by hardliners failed, accelerating dissolution. By December 1991, the Soviet Union formally ceased to exist. 15 independent republics emerged, Russia the largest successor, carrying forward languages, populations, and infrastructures. Yet the unified socialist state, with its planned economy, one-party rule, Comecon bloc, and Warsaw Pact military alliance, had quietly come to an end after 74 years. The parallel story of the Eastern European socialist states under Soviet influence followed a similar trajectory of rise, endurance, and dissolution. After 1945, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany, and Albania, until 1961, adopted Soviet-style systems, nationalized industry, collectivized agriculture, single-party rule, secret police, and alignment with Moscow through Comecon and the Warsaw Pact. Rapid industrialization lifted living standards from pre-war levels in many cases, education and healthcare expanded, women's participation in the workforce increased, yet legitimacy rested heavily on Soviet backing. The 1953 East German Uprising, 1956 Hungarian Revolution, 1968 Prague Spring, and 1980–1981 Polish Solidarity Movement revealed recurring popular discontent with shortages, repression, and lack of political choice. Each was suppressed, often with Soviet tanks or threat of intervention, yet the underlying tensions remained. By the late 1980s, Gorbachev's refusal to use force to preserve the bloc changed everything. Hungary opened its border with Austria in 1989, allowing East Germans to flee west. Mass demonstrations filled Leipzig, Prague, Sofia, and Bucharest. The Berlin Wall fell on November 9, 1989. Velvet Revolution swept Czechoslovakia. Solidarity triumphed in Polish elections. Ceausescu's regime in Romania collapsed violently on Christmas Day 1989. Within 2 years, all Warsaw Pact states had transitioned to multi-party systems and market-oriented economies, with varying degrees of success and social cost. The German Democratic Republic merged into the Federal Republic in 1990. The Socialist Bloc, with its Comecon integration, shared ideology, and coordinated security, dissolved not through external conquest but through internal exhaustion, loss of Soviet will to enforce conformity, and the cumulative weight of unmet promises. These late 20th century endings illustrate a particular pathway. Centralized systems that achieved rapid modernization and geopolitical weight eventually faltered under the burdens of inefficiency, repression, environmental strain, suppressed national aspirations, and the inability to adapt quickly enough when external pressures eased and internal voices grew louder. Populations persisted, cities remained, languages and cultures endured, often with renewed vitality after independence. Yet the overarching political and economic order that had defined an entire era faded into archival footage, renamed streets, and museum exhibits. As these reflections of empty May Day parades in Red Square, of jubilant crowds chipping at the Berlin Wall under floodlights, settle like the slow dimming of a very long day, we sense again the patient continuity beneath every transformation. No system, however total in its ambition or comprehensive in its control, escapes the quiet pressure of time, human aspiration, and changing circumstance. In the peaceful expanse still stretching before us, our journey will carry forward into the most contemporary layers of history, where globalized economies, digital networks, and fragile democracies continue to test the same enduring questions of endurance and change. For now, let your thoughts rest here in the hush that follows great shifts, breathing easily as the night wraps its gentle silence around every remaining image. As the hushed memories of emptied parade grounds and crumbling concrete walls settle like the slow settling of snow over forgotten monuments, we allow the mind to continue its calm, unresisted passage. The endings we have glimpsed in recent decades, through the quiet unwinding of planned economies, the release of suppressed voices once glasnost opened the door, the falling of barriers that had divided a continent, carry forward the same gentle, unchanging observation, that even systems engineered with total ambition and enforced with formidable power eventually reach moments where continuation exacts a price greater than adaptation or dissolution. The pattern holds as we move into the final layers of our reflection, closer still to the present hour, where globalized networks, digital infrastructures, fragile post-colonial states, resource-dependent economies, and climate-stressed societies continue to test the same ancient questions of endurance, balance, and inevitable yielding. Let us now turn our thoughts to the oil-rich monarchies and republics of the Persian Gulf, where extraordinary wealth from a single resource reshaped desert societies within a single human lifetime, creating glittering cities that seemed, for a moment, to defy every historical precedent of impermanence. From the mid-20th century onward, the discovery and commercialization of vast hydrocarbon reserves transformed small fishing and pearl diving communities into global financial hubs. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, and Oman, each in its own way, used petrodollars to fund massive infrastructure. Skyscrapers piercing the sky in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, artificial islands shaped like palm trees and world maps, indoor ski slopes in the desert, universities drawing scholars from every continent, sovereign wealth funds investing trillions in global equities, and social contracts promising citizens generous subsidies, tax-free salaries, and cradle-to-grave security in exchange for political quiescence. The United Arab Emirates offers perhaps the clearest example of this rapid ascent. Before oil exports began in the late 1960s, the Trucial States were a loose collection of sheikdoms under British protection, living on fishing, pearling, and modest trade. Federation in 1971 united 7 emirates under Abu Dhabi's leadership, with Dubai pursuing an independent path of commerce and openness. Oil revenues funded the transformation. Jebel Ali Port became one of the world's busiest container terminals, Dubai International Airport one of the busiest passenger hubs, Burj Khalifa the tallest building on Earth. Expatriate labor, mostly from South Asia, built the cities while Emirati citizens enjoyed high per capita income, free education, healthcare, and housing assistance. Similar stories unfolded across the Gulf. Qatar's liquefied natural gas exports funded education, city, and Al Jazeera. Kuwait rebuilt after the 1990 Iraqi invasion with generous reconstruction. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman sought to diversify away from oil dependency through entertainment megaprojects, tourism, women's workforce participation, and partial privatization of Aramco. Yet even here, in societies that appeared to have purchased insulation from history's usual cycles, subtle pressures have begun to accumulate. Global energy markets are shifting. The long-term transition toward renewables, driven by climate science, falling costs of solar and wind, electric vehicle adoption, and international commitments such as the Paris Agreement, threatens the core revenue stream. Oil demand may peak within the coming decades. Prices have already shown greater volatility since the 2014 crash. Gulf states hold among the lowest production costs globally, granting them resilience in a low-price environment, yet sustained low revenues strain generous welfare systems. Populations are young and growing. Subsidies and public sector jobs cannot expand indefinitely without depleting reserves or raising taxes in societies unaccustomed to either. Expatriate majorities in several states, over 80% in the UAE and Qatar, create demographic and social tensions. Guest workers have limited rights, cannot naturalize, and live under temporary visas, raising questions of long-term social cohesion and labor justice. Geopolitical risks add another layer. The 1990 Iraqi invasion of Kuwait demonstrated vulnerability to regional powers. The 2017-2021 Qatar blockade by Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt showed how quickly intra-Gulf alliances can fracture. Proxy conflicts in Yemen, Syria, and elsewhere drain resources and reputation. Climate change itself presses hardest on the region. Extreme heat already exceeds human tolerance thresholds for days each summer. Sea level rise threatens low-lying coastal cities and desalination-dependent freshwater supplies. Sandstorms grow more frequent as desertification advances. These pressures do not yet signal imminent collapse. Gulf monarchies have shown adaptability, investing heavily in post-oil futures, but they illustrate how even extraordinary resource windfalls cannot fully exempt a society from environmental, demographic, and economic realities. Should diversification succeed, new forms of prosperity may emerge. Should it falter, the social contract built on hydrocarbon rents could face strains that no previous generation in the region has had to navigate. Drifting now to another corner of the resource-rich world, we find the Democratic Republic of the Congo, a vast territory larger than Western Europe, endowed with extraordinary mineral wealth, cobalt, copper, coltan, diamonds, gold, tin, essential to modern electronics, batteries, and renewable energy technologies. Yet since independence in 1960, the country has experienced repeated cycles of state weakness, conflict, and extraction without broad development. The early post-colonial period under Patrice Lumumba ended in assassination and the rise of Mobutu Sese Seko, whose 32-year rule, 1965-1997, became synonymous with kleptocracy. Nationalized industries looted, infrastructure left to decay, debt ballooned, and Zarianization policies drove away skilled expatriates while enriching a narrow elite. The First and Second Congo Wars, 1996-2003, involved 9 African states and dozens of armed groups, claimed over 5 million lives through violence, disease, and starvation, and left the state apparatus in ruins. Even after the 2003 peace accords and the 2006 elections that brought Joseph Kabila to power, patterns persisted. Mineral extraction continued, often through joint ventures with foreign firms, but revenues rarely reached public budgets in full. Corruption, tax evasion, and illicit trade siphoned wealth abroad. Artisanal mining in eastern provinces remained chaotic, with armed groups taxing production, exploiting child labor, and fueling cycles of violence. Infrastructure, roads, electricity, schools, hospitals, stayed rudimentary outside Kinshasa and a few mining hubs. Population growth outpaced development, poverty rates hovered near 70%, Ebola outbreaks in the east exposed fragile health systems. Felix Tshisekedi's 2019 election marked the first peaceful transfer of power, yet governance challenges remain immense. Debt restructuring, security sector reform, decentralization, and equitable resource distribution all demand coordination a weak state struggles to provide. The Congo's story is not one of sudden collapse but of chronic fragility, a state that has never fully consolidated since independence, repeatedly undermined by elite predation, foreign interference, regional meddling, and the paradox of resource wealth that attracts conflict rather than funding inclusive growth. The people endure, resilient farmers, traders, musicians, urban survivalists. Yet the dream of a unified, prosperous nation harnessing its mineral endowment for broad benefit remains deferred, century after century of potential quietly leaking away. As these images of mirrored skyscrapers rising from desert sands under relentless sun, of cobalt-stained hands sifting earth in eastern Congo's rain-soaked pits, settle softly like the last light fading from a very distant horizon, we recognize once again the patient rhythm that has accompanied every story we have followed. No windfall, no matter how vast, no territory, no matter how resource-rich, escapes the necessity of balance. Between extraction and renewal, between elite enrichment and popular welfare, between short-term gain and long-term resilience. In the tranquil closing stretch of our journey, we will turn toward the most contemporary and still unfolding transformations. Climate-driven migrations, digital dependencies, democratic backsliding in fragile states, supply chain fragilities exposed by pandemics and conflicts, each one reminding us that the arc of rise and fall continues without pause, inviting the same calm acceptance we have carried from the very beginning. For now, let your breathing deepen into the slowest possible cadence. Let these final reflections rest without weight upon you, and allow the night to carry every remaining thought into complete, gentle stillness. As the faint shimmer of Gulf skyscrapers under a merciless sun, and the quiet labor of hands sifting cobalt-rich earth in distant rain forests continue to rest like the final wisps of smoke from a long-extinguished fire, we allow the mind to drift one last time slowly, without hurry or need for conclusion. Stories we have followed, from the first salt-poisoned fields of Sumer to the silent plazas of the Maya, from the abandoned relay posts of the Mongol steppe to the emptied parade grounds of a fallen superpower, from mirrored towers built on finite oil to mineral-rich lands where wealth never quite reaches the people, carry the same soft, unchanging whisper that every human arrangement, no matter how grand, how ingeniously engineered, or how briefly triumphant, exists within the patient current of time. Nothing endures unchanged. The land shifts, rains falter, resources thin, ideas evolve, people move or remember differently, and what once seemed eternal quietly yields to what follows. In these closing reflections, let us turn our gaze toward the most contemporary and still unfolding transformations, the ones that touch the present hour and stretch uncertainly into whatever comes next. Across the world, societies now navigate pressures unlike any faced by their predecessors, yet built from the same elemental materials, the limits of the physical earth, the needs and desires of growing populations, the fragility of cooperation among strangers, and the accelerating speed of change itself. Climate patterns, altered by cumulative human activity, press hardest where vulnerability was already greatest. Low-lying island nations, Maldives, Kiribati, Tuvalu, watch shorelines retreat year by year, entire villages relocated as salt water intrudes into freshwater lenses and taro pits. Coastal megacities, Jakarta, Miami, Dhaka, Lagos, spend billions on sea walls, pumps, and drainage while knowing that storm surges grow taller and more frequent. Mountain glaciers that once fed the Indus, Ganges, Mekong, and Yangtze shrink visibly. Downstream agriculture, hydropower, and drinking water for hundreds of millions hang in delicate balance. Droughts lengthen in the Horn of Africa, the Sahel, Southern Africa, and parts of the American West, pushing pastoralists and farmers into migration corridors already strained by conflict or poverty. Heat waves now reach thresholds that make outdoor labor lethal for days at a time in South Asia, the Persian Gulf, and parts of the Mediterranean. These are not future hypotheticals. They are measurable shifts already reshaping settlement patterns, food systems, insurance markets, and national budgets. At the same time, digital infrastructures once hailed as liberators from distance and scarcity reveal their own brittleness. Undersea cables that carry 99% of international data traffic remain vulnerable to accidental damage, sabotage, or deliberate severance. Satellite constellations promise redundancy yet depend on rare earth minerals mined in politically unstable regions. Cloud services centralize knowledge and computation in the hands of a few corporations, creating single points of failure when outages cascade or when governments impose restrictions. Misinformation spreads faster than verification. Algorithmic amplification rewards outrage over nuance, trust in shared facts phrase. Supply chains for semiconductors, batteries, pharmaceuticals, and fertilizers stretch across dozens of borders. Taiwan produces over 60% of the world's advanced chips. China dominates rare earth refining. A handful of companies control most potash and phosphate, making the entire global economy susceptible to localized shocks, earthquakes, export controls, pandemics, or geopolitical standoffs. Democratic institutions, fragile in many places even at their strongest moments, face erosion from within and without. Populist leaders in various regions have tested or crossed constitutional boundaries, curtailing judicial independence, controlling media, rewriting electoral rules, or declaring emergencies to extend terms. Polarization, fueled by echo chambers and economic insecurity, reduces space for compromise. In some nations, military or oligarchic structures quietly reassert influence when civilian governments falter. At the same time, younger generations in many societies express disillusionment with formal politics, turning instead to decentralized movements, digital activism, or simple withdrawal, each choice carrying its own long-term consequence for collective decision-making. Yet none of these pressures exists in isolation from human response. Adaptation continues. Coastal cities experiment with floating districts and mangrove restoration. Renewable energy deployment accelerates, solar and wind now cheaper than new coal in most places. Circular economy models, precision agriculture, desalination advances, and reforestation projects seek to close loops that earlier industrial systems left open. International agreements, imperfect, slowly enforced, still coordinate action on ozone depletion, nuclear non-proliferation, trade standards, pandemic preparedness. Communities in vulnerable regions form mutual aid networks, revive traditional knowledge of drought-resistant crops, or negotiate managed retreat with dignity rather than panic. Individuals quietly choose smaller families, more plant-based diets, local sourcing, or reduced consumption, not always visibly dramatic, yet cumulatively powerful. What ties all these contemporary shifts to the ancient stories we began with is the same underlying reality. No civilization solves every problem forever. Each era inherits limits it did not choose and creates new ones it cannot fully foresee. The difference now is scale and speed. Billions of lives interconnected, planetary systems altered in decades rather than millennia, information moving at light speed while wisdom accumulates slowly. The outcome remains unwritten, not because history has stopped, but because it never stops. Every generation faces its own version of the same quiet question. How long can the present arrangement hold before something must give way, and what will be carried forward when it does? As we reach the end of this long, gentle recounting, let the weight of all these endings and beginnings rest lightly upon you. The Sumerian fields that slowly salinized, the Maya pyramids reclaimed by vines, the Mongol relay posts overtaken by grass, the Soviet banners furled for the last time, the desert cities still rising yet already shadowed by changing skies, all belong to the same unbroken stream. Nothing is lost entirely. Fragments endure in language, memory, technique, story. And nothing is permanent. That knowledge, accepted without alarm, can be a source of deep calm. If this quiet journey through time has brought you any measure of rest or reflection, please let us know in the comments. Where are you watching this history video from, and what time is it where you are? Share the name of your city, your country, the room you're in, the hour on your clock, whatever small detail feels right. And if you would like more long, soothing explorations of the past like this one, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There are many more stories waiting to be told, always in the same calm voice, always inviting you to close your eyes and drift whenever you are ready. For now, let your breathing slow to its gentlest rhythm. Let every thought soften and fade. The night is here, patient and kind. Rest well.